I am very honored to introduce Greg Walton of Stanford University. Hi. Mary Murphy from Indiana University, and Claude Steele from Stanford University. And I'm going to start off with some questions for them, but this is intended to be a conversation among three old friends and colleagues. So I have invited them to feel free to build on each other's comments, and it will, if it's anything like the prep call, we'll just dive right into a conversation very quickly. So Claude, can you just start us off and give us some history and background on some of these ideas and the development of them in psychology?
Okay, I'll try to. But I should say, I do feel like I belong here. It's just a good feeling. I think one way to I'm just going to try to, maybe more than go through all the details of history, just characterize where the space that I think has emerged in all this research, which is, if you think about our educational pedagogies in general, I think they've had a big hole in them, which is that they haven't appreciated the importance of subjective psychological experience in learning and schooling and the management of that. And we really haven't appreciated the degree to which our identities, our social identities, our race, our sexual orientation, our gender, our class, affect that subjective experience of education and the student's ability to engage what is offered in school. But that as our population becomes increasingly diverse, both in terms of ethnicity and the social identities, and I think also in terms of income, one consequence of income inequality is just a much larger proportion of our students come from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. 54% of the students in the United States public schools are poor. So I don't think we have a pedagogy that is really geared to this challenge. Our pedagogy we inherit from a history in which we weren't concerned with educating the full breadth of American society, and so a lot of the assumptions and the practices and the beliefs about how education happens are built in a context in which the target group was a pretty homogeneous group, and these issues that I'm just talking about, the subjective psychological experience, wasn't probably as important as it is moving forward as a society. So I have a strong sense that this work is at the center of where we need to go as educators. I think it will take some time. Anybody who does research knows it's difficult, and you don't want to claim things or say things that aren't really valid or aren't really useful, and so I don't know. After many years of doing it, you have an inherent caution about it. But at the same time, I think it's the only way we're going to get to an understanding of how to educate our population that is going to work for us. I think a lot of the stagnation in education isn't so much in a lack of will or maybe even particular policies, as much as it is a lack of appreciation of the importance of this class of experiences. So I don't know. I think that in general kind of situates our work.
Great. Do you want to add anything to what Claude just said?
I think that was great.
I've got a follow-up question. Claude, so I know that a lot of different disciplines think about belonging. Can you just define for us how does psychology define belonging? What does this mean from your?
You should probably ask him about that, because I'm going to just play the old man for a minute here, but he was an undergraduate at Stanford, and he came into my office, and the thing he was interested in our research, and the thing he was most interested in was the issue of belonging. So I don't know anybody who's in psychology who's internalized and focused on that question as much as Greg has over the years. So I think he'd be a better person to characterize it at this point.
So I want to, maybe what I'll say then is why I was interested in belonging, and part of why I was interested in belonging was because of the work that Claude had done before I'd ever come to college. So Claude had done this work on stereotype threat, this work showing that if you just change the representation of a test, you say it's a test, You produce group differences. African American students do less well than European American students. You give them the very same task and you describe it as a laboratory puzzle-solving exercise, a scheme concocted by cognitive psychologists trying to understand how people solve hard puzzles. And suddenly the inequality goes away, controlling for SAT scores. In fact, we know now African American students do better than white students a little bit in that circumstance. And Claude had always talked about stereotype threat from the beginning as a fear about how you're seen in a context. Who is it that I appear to be in this setting from the perspective of other people, from a generalized perspective? And if I take on this task and I do badly, will that seem to confirm a negative stereotype about my group? Will that seem to confirm that black people aren't smart, that women can't do math and science? And that's a perception that's threatening to the self. And I was inspired by that, and it made me think about belonging, because I thought that's really fundamentally a story about belonging, about who I seem to be in this setting, how I appear, whether or not other people are really respecting me and valuing me in ways that can allow me to perform well and succeed.
Great. So, Greg, can you just, building on that, what have we learned from studies, yours and other people, about what are the effects of these belonging concerns on long-term educational outcomes?
Yeah, so I think that I'll start with the study that you began with, the WISE feedback study, which owes its origins to the dissertation that Jeff Cohen conducted at Stanford with Claude and Lee Ross, exploring in laboratory circumstances how changing the preface that goes with critical feedback can affect students' response to that. And that work was really rooted again in stereotype threat. The work began with the idea that when you receive critical feedback across a group divide, when a woman in math or science is receiving critical feedback from a man, when an African American student is receiving critical feedback from a white instructor, there can be a mistrust that arises in that exchange, that you could worry as a recipient in that circumstance that maybe that feedback reflects a negative judgment or even a stereotypical judgment, maybe the bias on the part of the feedback giver. And if you have that view, then you're going to mistrust the feedback. You're not going to want to engage with that. You're not going to want to be motivated in response to it. And the field studies that David and Valerie Purdy-Bonds and Jeff conducted showed the implications of that in a field setting. Now, one thing that's really important to emphasize about that is that the outcome effects that Lisa showed you on things like discipline and things like college-going rates, they illustrate not what WISE feedback sort of simply does, but what it can do. And it illustrates more broadly what interventions to address belonging can accomplish. But that potential for those kinds of exercises or reforms to produce those kinds of changes in educational outcomes depends on lots of other things, lots of other affordances in the context and aspects of the timing. So, for example, the WISE feedback studies were premised on the observation that was a period, the intervention was delivered in a period, 7th grade, when African American students were showing declines in their levels of trust, in their teachers, in school. It's a time when African American students were becoming more and more aware of negative stereotypes, negative racial stereotypes that exist in society, that might exist in their school, that might exist in their teachers' minds. And it was in that context of declining trust that a message from a teacher who said, I'm giving you tough critical feedback because I have high standards and I think that you can meet them, became a transformational event for those students. But the timing mattered there, and that coming from the teacher at that time mattered. I once talked about this work to a group of business people in Silicon Valley, and somebody came up to me afterward and said, wow, that work's amazing. Do I have to say it? I'm a manager. I give feedback all the time. Do I have to say it every time? And the answer is obviously no, you don't have to say it every time. But the point is you have to establish a common ground understanding with the people that you're interacting with that this is what we're doing when we're giving critical feedback. And when you accomplish that, that's when you can really see transformational effects.
I'd like to build on that. I think that one of the most important things that study gets across is the importance of relationship, the importance of trust, right? That I feel seen by my teacher thinks I have this ability. It's being communicated on a one-on-one basis. From the student's perspective, they get this note, and it seems as though it's coming from the teacher, and they're saying, I think you have the ability. I think you have the potential, right, to meet my expectations, my high expectations. And I think that that's critical because I think that those relationships many times we think about belonging and how education has oftentimes operationalized belonging is with regard to the number of relationships or the number of connections students have. So, we'll have students report, how many friends do you have in this class or in that class or at the school? And I think that that's really just hitting the surface of what belonging is. You can have a lot of friends or a lot of people that you sort of relate to at school, but if all of your friends are sort of ghettoized, right, not actually included or valued or respected in the mainstream part of what school is or what the mainstream part of what work is, that's problematic. That's not going to increase our sense of belonging in our institutions like school or work, right? And so it's not just the number of connections, it's the quality of those relationships, right? And so we have to think more critically about what relationships are, how we actually foster those relationships. I think one of the most nice parts of that exercise that you had us do was really thinking, and someone shared, the importance of an authority figure who conferred to us a sense of belonging, a sense of respect, a sense of value, right? And I think that's critical, not just peer relationships, but also these more hierarchical relationships that sort of tell me, I see you for who you are in your fullness of your identity, and I value you, I respect you, and I want to share this learning experience with you. And I think that's what some of the best teachers do, and I think that that's critical to developing and sustaining a sense of belonging in education contexts.
And Claude, I know when we spoke earlier, you mentioned that this idea of student psychology is sort of key to the black box of understanding how teaching leads to learning. So I don't know if you want to build on Mary's point there a little bit, but I was struck by that comment earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I think it may not appear, this kind of work may not appear obvious from the more conventional approach to pedagogy, that it's more that, if I'm going to roughly characterize, more information transmission, skill building, and a good teacher is somebody that knows how to convey the information effectively and the like. But I think this work is asking us to recognize the importance of this other aspect of it, that we also have to understand this subjective experience and the psychology of it. I think it's visible from the kind of exercises we were doing this morning. When you think about yourself and what you were thinking about when you were a freshman in high school, it kind of comes into view. All these things are there, but when we're looking as observers at students, we miss that. And we think it's more, and that's where in a diverse society we're going wrong. And I think the way you put it was really good. Teachers have to build in students some sense of beneficence, that you got my back. Like the teacher believes in me and is going to support me and be with me. And in a society where trust is not an issue, in a more homogeneous community, a high status sector of society, that trust may be easier to assume, and you can just go right ahead. But today, in today's schooling, in our society, you have to build that, and that's going to be an important part of teaching and education, I think, is to build that sense of in students that my school has some beneficence toward me, cares about me, it's going to take me seriously. I can trust it. I can relax, pay attention. If I can't do that, a lot of my cognitive resources are going to be applied to vigilance to threat. I'm going to be talking to other people about what they think about the place. A lot of effort is going to go into that. So you have to put that to rest.
I think an important point in what Claude is saying is the importance of really taking different perspectives when we think about school context, taking the perspective, getting out of a kind of quote-unquote generic or neutral perspective, not that one exists, or an outsider sort of third-party perspective, but asking, what is this environment, what is this classroom, what does this school look like to X, to Y, to Z, to the teacher, to the parent, to the child. The importance of that is going to be underscored in a variety of places where we see the basic finding that message intended is not message received. So you see that in the critical feedback context. I mean, why, if you're a teacher, why do you go into teaching? You don't go into it for the good pay and the good hours, right? You go into it often because you want to make a difference for kids, and often because you want to make a difference, especially for those kids who are coming from more disadvantaged backgrounds. And then you go into that setting and you work hard to give critical feedback that a student can use. You stay up late, maybe, and you give that, you go through those essays, and you give them good comments that they can use, and you give it to them, and you think it's there for you. Like, take it up, like respond. And then the student doesn't respond. That's very discouraging. But the student doesn't know that you had those intentions, and they can't assume that, especially when that feedback is going across group lines.
Mary, did you want to?
Well, I was going to build on a little bit of what Claude was saying about, I think that one of the concerns I think that people have in the field of education is sort of how does this squishy stuff around belonging actually impact learning and achievement in educational settings. And I think it's really critical to understand some of those processes. I mean, we've had several studies that have really shown and been meta-analyzed across hundreds of studies that some of the mechanisms here really undermine cognitive function, right? That when I am distracted by looking at all the cues to see, do I really belong? This person treated me weird. Does that really mean that I don't belong here? Let me ask someone else. Let's see how other people like me are being treated. Suddenly, my attention and vigilance are really put to that question of, do I belong? That belonging uncertainty idea, right? Which means that my executive function, my cognitive abilities are literally divided, right? Part of my attention is put to those cues and understanding of the context. Do I fit here? Am I valued? Am I respected? Which means that only half of my resources are really put to the problem I'm trying to solve at hand, right? Trying to learn what the teacher is telling me, trying to figure out the equations or read the math problem, right? And so literally these students who, because they belong to stigmatized backgrounds where these stereotypes impugn their abilities, right? Suddenly I'm looking for more evidence about whether I belong. I only have half the cognitive resources to put to my problem, and that's a real disparity, right? That's like a cognitive intellectual disparity that is exacted among students who belong to certain groups and not other groups. Students that don't have to worry about sense of belonging because education sort of values them implicitly have 100% of their cognitive resources that they can put to the problems that they're studying, right? And that's how these inequalities in these learning environments develop. It's how belonging actually shapes our brain and our ability to actually process, learn, encode, and remember information, and to be able to give information, recall information when asked to do so. And that's really one of the mechanisms by how belonging, the squishy idea about feeling as though you fit and that you're respected, has real implications for these disparities we see in performance.
Can I give an example from your work?
Yes, please do.
So Mary did this fabulous study with Claude on taking students who are interested, women and men who are interested in math, science, and engineering, and showing them a video of a math, science, engineering conference that they might go to. And they manipulated, in this study, the representation of women at this ostensible conference. In some cases, there was an equitable representation of women. In some cases, there were many more men than women. And one finding was that women felt like they wouldn't belong as much in the male-dominated setting, unsurprising and concerning. But another finding was that women showed this vigilance response in the context where the men were dominating in the setting. They showed this physiologically, but they also showed this cognitively. They remember more kind of irrelevant details of the video. Now imagine you're actually a woman, maybe you're Lisa going to a physics conference, and you're walking around this space that's 3/4 male, and you're attending to all these other things. Well, you're not actually looking at the poster, right? You're not actually looking at the, you're not actually listening to the talk. Like, you're not actually thinking about the content and building your understanding and connecting ideas the way that you would be able to if you weren't burdened by those belonging-related concerns.
So, Mary, I know one of the things that's come up in your research recently is this idea of prejudiced places versus prejudiced people. So this is a topic that we talk a lot about in education right now. So maybe you could speak a little bit to that.
Sure. In my lab, we've been talking a lot and thinking about sort of a overarching theoretical framework around where we locate sort of the problems that we see in educational environments. And for many years, I think, and the dominant approach has really been, a lot of times we will see or hear that some teachers are behaving culturally insensitively, or showing some bias, racial bias, or gender bias, or bias against low SES students. And the issue here is that when we locate prejudice within people, the implication of that is that then we need to address that prejudiced person, right? That bad apple. Maybe they need more training. Maybe they need, reformation in some way, right? And what we do when we engage those individuals in this kind of cultural inclusion kind of training, that's great and probably essential. but it doesn't change the larger context. It leaves in place these stereotypes and these concerns around belonging in the larger context that continue to exact inequalities in people's ability to learn and their ability to perform and their ability to feel as though they belong in these settings. So we've changed the focus from prejudiced people to prejudiced places. And it really sort of allows us to take the target's perspective, underrepresented students, students from underserved, underachieving backgrounds, right? To really see how they see the environment. What are the cues in that environment? What are the things the faculty are saying? What are the things peers are doing, right? How is the place structured that communicate to me how I'm valued and respected or devalued and disrespected there? So prejudiced places are places that sort of systematically and predictably exact inequalities in people's both experience and their outcomes. Similar to ideas of institutional bias that really focus on sort of outcomes, has these disparities in the way people get treated or the way they perform. Also, we need to include the psychological experience there. There are inequalities in the way people are psychologically experiencing their environment that have huge implications for whether they stay in those environments, whether they feel as though they fit, and whether they can perform well. And so we need to be thinking about prejudiced places. And that changes the lever for intervention. Instead of just focusing on individuals, right, we need to be focusing on institutions and contexts. What are the policies and practices that students actually help students feel as though they belong and that they fit in these contexts?
Thank you. So before we look forward into the field, just want to see if you guys have any other comments or thoughts you want to share before we look forward into future directions in the research.
I just tie the beginning and the end of this bit together. So, the original studies that Claude and Steve Spencer and Josh Aronson did on stereotype threat, where you just manipulate whether a test is said to be evaluative or not evaluative, that's an example of what Mary's talking about as prejudiced places. You don't have to be a prejudiced person to describe a test as evaluative of somebody's ability. There's no particular reason to think that you would be. But when you say that, you create an environment that produces disadvantage, group-based disadvantage. And so thinking about prejudiced places lets us start to say, what are the contexts that we are collectively creating that disadvantage groups of students, and how can we remedy those?
And I'll just build on that. I think the elegance of those original studies was that the researchers, Claude and Jeff and others, went to great amounts to be sure that the students in the different conditions who got the diagnostic test and the non-diagnostic test were equal, right, in terms of a lot of different characteristics. It was not about the student. It was about the way the test was framed. And it produced inequalities, both in psychological experiences, their cognitive functioning, as well as their performance, right? One of the concerns I have around belonging, and that I want to be sure we don't fall into, is sort of thinking about belonging as a problem of the student. Again, we so often go into, there's real problem. Why can't the student just feel as though they belong? I mean, come on, right? But we set up these spaces of belonging, right? And how can we engage in practices and policies and procedures, right? Relationships, ways in which we structure these environments to actually produce contexts of belonging, places of non-prejudice, places of belonging. I think that that's really the challenge as we look forward, and not to sort of put this again as a problem of the student.
I would, just jumping on that, I think that in part we have a paradigm of colorblind assimilation at the root of education, education being kind of a process by which we're going to incorporate people into the mainstream of society and the like, and we've kind of made a deal. I, as the incorporator, will try to be colorblind. I won't see your identity, and you assimilate as fast as you can to the mainstream standards. In academia, we problematize that a bit, but down on the ground, that's probably the operating model. But I think when you think about, again, diversity, there's something naive about that and blinding about that. Taking that approach, you don't see these processes. And so we don't see the extent of them because we don't see the process. But diversity, which is a magnificent thing, I think it's the core, well, a prime core of American strength as a society, the contribution of diversity, but it's not an anodyne thing. It's not just a shallow, bringing people together who are, difference of shade, skin color, and if we could just assume, if we give you the opportunity, everybody's kind of equal. We're bringing together people from groups that have had profoundly different experiences in this society and continue to have profoundly different experiences in this society. And so when you think about setting up an educational interaction of some sort, I think that's the foundation. We haven't been assuming that. We've assuming that this sort of colorblind, everybody can kind of step in and take the best that we have to offer, as you guys have just described. But if I'm coming from a group that has had a lot of trouble in this society, to put it euphemistically, and continues to have trouble, and I see it on television, I don't know if I can trust you. That's a big question for me in my subjective psychological experience. Can I really trust you? And so I think there's just in the structure of our society, the history of our society, there is this challenge that in the classroom we have to do these things in order to accommodate that and to deal with it in some effective way. In order to be effective as educators, I think we have to deal with it. But I just wanted to add that because I think it's deep. It's not just in a classroom, A, B, or C. It's a deep feature of American life this part of the challenge.
We have to contend with the idea that there are these belonging inequalities, right?
Yeah.
That in American society.
Yeah.
That have been caused by policies and practices, and so the remedies have to be deeper than just putting people together, right?
Yeah, I mean, we've used identity in society to engineer advantage for centuries.
Yeah.
And people know it, and it's hard to sweep that aside and just say, well, I'm going to trust that you're going to be colorblind today. I'm going to trust that and fully engage and love you. So anyway, just wanted to get to the root of the issue.
All right, so I'm going to ask one last question, then we'll open it up for the group. So when you think looking forward, the field of research on belonging, what do you all, I want to ask each of you guys to answer this, what do you see as sort of where the field needs to be going? What are the questions we need to be asking, and how do we need to be answering them? So any one of you can feel free to jump in.
There's a couple things that come to mind. So one is, I think that it's very helpful if educators at all levels would have more psychological wisdom about belonging. To go beyond a shallow understanding to a deeper understanding that can move practice. To understand first, that belonging is high-quality relationships of trust. Belonging is the foundation for learning. That if you're going to engage in the intimate relationship of challenging a student and trying to help them build and grow in a complicated, difficult space, that you need to begin with a strong relationship. To understand why that relationship may be at risk and why the student's sense of belonging may be at risk, even when you're well-intended. And then to start to begin to understand evidence-based practices that educators can use and adapt in ways that are effective with feedback that helps them learn and improve to improve their practice and improve their students' outcomes. So take wise feedback. I think a very important question is, how can we communicate effectively with educators about the nature of wise feedback, miscommunications in wise feedback, and effective ways to communicate feedback that produce learning environments that drive improvement. A second question is that what research has done has begun to show us a variety of different tools, practices, exercises, approaches that can bolster students' sense of belonging and, at least in some cases, produce significant lasting gains on core educational outcomes for the groups that we're most concerned with in society. But we need to understand essentially questions about generalizability and heterogeneity. Where and with whom and in what context do those kinds of practices help and what do we learn from understanding those interactions, both about those practices and exercises themselves, and about the context that they're being situated in, and how we can then address both to create more belonging, friendly environments. So the first is really educators' wisdom and understanding. The second is really understanding the heterogeneity between tools and exercises that we're increasingly developing and their situatedness in context.
Great, thank you.
I'd say the next frontier of a lot of this work is really going to be helping teachers develop practices and pedagogy around what are the ways in which I create a community of belonging in my classroom. And I've been doing some of this work with Megan Bang and Stephanie Freiberg, where we've worked with kindergarten through 6th grade teachers and developed a curriculum to develop growth mindset, inclusive growth mindset cultures in their classrooms. So how do we actually, what are the practices with regard to feedback, with regard to evaluation, with regard to introducing difficult topics, with regard to setting up peer interactions, right? With regard to what we actually post on the wall when we're trying to celebrate improvement or progress or achievement in class, right? And how do we understand that through a cultural lens? I think it's really important for teachers to not only engage in sort of these practices, but to have a deeper understanding about students' backgrounds and how those backgrounds actually inform the way they interpret or make meaning of my interaction with my teacher. What are the roles and, Stephanie will laugh at this, roles, right, relationships and responsibilities that we have as instructors to create these cultures and to understand where my students are coming from and meet them in the language of their own cultural background so that they feel included and belonging in a way that seems authentic to them, not in sort of the Western white kind of way of connecting, but in other domains, right, of being able to connect. What are those practices? And so developing an understanding of that, testing it, and being able to teach it to teachers and see how they implement it authentically in their classroom. That's been a big focus of our work, and I think that is sort of the next generation of really how to put this work into practice.
Basically, I would say here, here. I think that's exactly where things should be targeted. I feel at the conceptual side of things, we're developing a clearer and clearer picture of what the predicament of many students is. That word is a predicament. Our history as a society, the structure of our society, the way in which we've used it to organize, we've used identity to organize society, creates a predicament for students in school, a lot of our students in school, perhaps the majority at this point in school, such that I don't know if I belong, I don't know if I can trust you, I don't know if you're going to discriminate against me, I don't know if you're going to ostracize me. I've got a predicament that just coming into the place gives to me. And I think as one way of characterizing it is, I'm borrowing a metaphor from Kazuo Ishiguro, who said this in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech in literature last year about the tension between remembering and forgetting. That these students have a tension between remembering how their group is seen and been treated and continuing versus forgetting that in order to engage what's in front of them. And that I'm reading the cues, I'm reading things to know whether I can forget and just engage and love you, or whether I trust you, or whether I got to be careful here. And I think that is the legacy of our, the ongoing legacy of our society and our history as a society. It's not like our history's over and it's just gone. It's still quite with us. And so I think the job of research is, and in addition to this, I also want to, there are cultural differences. There are ways there are differences in cultural capital that one brings to the school setting. When I went to graduate school to stay out of Vietnam. Seemed like a good reason. I didn't really know what it was about. I didn't come from a background that knew really what it was about. And so I needed some concrete instruction about that. And so if somebody didn't appreciate that predicament and that situation, they wouldn't know, they wouldn't have the right pedagogy to function. And I think the challenge of research and education I believe it's the #1 challenge in education is the research that we're hearing about here, that it is what will etch out tactics and in some period of years create a new pedagogy for the society.
Great. Thank you all. All right, so we're going to open it up to questions now. Just to bear in mind our norm, that we want to be able to answer as many questions as possible, so just try to keep questions brief so we can give the floor to lots of people in our conversation.
I'd say yes, but we also need to do more work on this. I think that we do know sort of a set of cues, a set of interactions, a set of ways, evaluative strategies, feedback strategies, ways of setting up interactions in the classroom that actually have disparate impact on students' psychological experiences of a sense of belonging, a sense of inclusion, and their performance. So I think we do have a good set of knowledge there, but I think that there are many other things that need to be explored, and people are continuing to do this work.
There's work by Kent Harbour showing, for example, that white evaluators respond to poor essays from black students with more praise than they would to the same essay from a white student. So you can see this attempt on the part of white evaluators to not be critical of a black student who's produced a poor essay by essentially lowering the bar for that student. And that's obviously not at all helpful in the long run. And I think it comes about partly because educators are kind of grasping for the wise feedback idea, but they don't have it yet. And they don't know how to communicate effectively. I'm going to give you critical feedback, and it's because I have high standards and I think you can meet them. And if they grasp that fully and confidently and could carry that forward in their interactions with the students, it would be better for them and better for the student. So that I think that absolutely happens, and there's formal research showing that happens within social psychology. And it's one of the reasons why that's an important problem space for us to work in.
I think one of the things we've seen, and just to tie it back to what Claude was saying about color blindness, is that we do see, at least in our work, that many of the teachers who come into our institute at the beginning of the week really do sort of think that color blindness is the right way, right, to interact with students, to not really identify differences or engage in understanding students' different backgrounds, because we're all the same here, right? I want to create a learning environment where we're all the same. And we know that by the end of the week, once they sort of really take students' perspectives and really see how the different practices that they're engaging with actually have different meaning for different students, we see changes in terms of, okay, we need to value diversity, we need to give voice to difference, we need to embrace these sorts of things, and we can actually see change with that kind of change in pedagogy.
It's interesting. I'm going to just jump in here because I have a thought. So once you have a thought, you better stick with it. My thought is that being a parent of minority kids is a good way to see what some of the challenges are, because a lot has to do with the kind of understanding the parent tries to give the student of the world they're in, the school and what it means, and you're always kind of struggling between, the kind of false consciousness thing, oh, this is a post-racial world, it's all over, everything is cool, versus it's really a dark, there's prejudice behind every move. So you're trying to find somewhere in there to help them see this, and I think this is the right focus of research, is how do you help children understand the reality of American society. And I think it's something, a challenge for all of us. I think from research, I'm not going to go into it right now, but it was a great study that Greg did, where you're kind of controlling the narrative. You're helping the students see the narrative. So it I think coincides a lot with what clinical psychology does, where you help normalize the anxieties and the pressures the student feels, that your son, for example, feels in the 7th grade with this teacher. You acknowledge that. You don't deny that. You don't say, oh, that teacher's, you don't give them a false, because that's not going to work. You acknowledge it, but you help them see a optimistic road concrete road forward of some sort. I think Obama was really good at this, kind of acknowledging the realities of our society, but helping us focus on a hopeful prospect of change and where we should put our energies. And I think that kind of that is a concrete, researchable approach to that particular dilemma. What kind of narrative, what kind of advice, counseling do students really need to deal with the truth of American society? We're asking them to ignore a lot that they experience at this point. And the colorblind approach is, in asking that, building more mistrust in them of the world they're in and of the larger society in general, because they're experiencing things that don't fit with that colorblind story. What happens what does a person do when you experience that? Well, you disengage. Now you're managing, you're playing the situation because it's a different situation now. So I think this is really an important part of the phenomenon to understand. And out of it will come, I think, a lot of the particular things that are being researched as strategies, forms of feedback, forms of advising that help students deal with it, and things that institutions can do to prevent that kind of alienation. And so I could say more, but I should stop at this point.
Yeah, I think that one of the critical parts there is to really help institutions and culture creators in educational environments to see this perspective, right? To see that your son was contending with a racist teacher and what that does to his ability to learn and to engage in the classroom, and to be concerned about that and to want to do something about it, right? How do we get institutions and teachers and principals and culture creators in these settings to actually take that intergroup perspective, to see both the blatant things that people are contending with and the subtle things, right? The institutional practices that are creating these problematic environments, prejudiced places, right? I'd say that the prejudiced people are alive and well. And it's important to acknowledge that and to have strategies to deal with them. But we can't just focus on prejudiced people. We also have to focus on the context that actually support them continuing to be in the environment, continuing to be a teacher in the classroom.
Claude, can I tell a story about you going to grad school?
Sure. I think.
So here's the story as I know it. Claude can correct it. So, Claude goes to grad school at Ohio State, and he's the only black person in the whole department at the time.
Who scored 62 points against Michigan this weekend.
There's pride there.
I taught at Michigan for a while, so.
You have allegiance in both ways.
And he's feeling, am I selling out by going to grad school, this white place? And there's this, to make matters worse, there's this professor down the hall who's just racist, who's just saying racist things. And when the professor says these racist things, Claude thinks it confirms these fears in his mind that I don't belong here, I'm selling out, this isn't the place for me. But then independently, he starts his work with his advisor, and it has nothing to do with race or social justice in particular, it's just social psychology work, but it's productive, and they form a team, and he sees how you do a study and how you do the next study and how that could lead to a publication, and he can forecast this path for himself. And the racist professor down the hall is still saying the racist stuff, but it's no longer as threatening. It no longer has the generalized meaning that it had. Earlier, Lisa invited us to think about times where we feel like we belong in a setting, but we don't really have good relationships there. And I think it's important, and Mary earlier talked about how belonging is a kind of a symbolic understanding. We're responding to kind of symbolic cues. It's not just derivative of particular relationships. So it's possible to be in a place where there's a person who's racist, there are people who are racist, but those people don't come to seem to define the setting for you. And one way that can happen is, as Mary's saying, is because of leadership in the setting. So if the school as a whole, or the leadership of the school as a whole, represents that person as a bad apple to be dealt with and not reflecting the values of the place as a whole, that can be helpful. So there's wiggle room there in that context that can help us with students, I think.
I would say yes, it's deeply important to appreciate that predicament. I think they're blinded from it by what they think are the appropriate sort of colorblind approach to students. We're going to see everybody as individuals and insistently see everybody, willfully see everybody as individuals, and so miss that predicament. That's the cost of colorblindness. And so the pedagogies, the approaches to teaching, the impact of cues in the setting that affect that predicament are not appreciated and not dealt with. And so that is a huge force, I believe, in our ability in education's ability to incorporate our population into the mainstream is blindness to that predicament. So I think it's immensely important. I think once you recognize that, a lot of teachers intuitively get it. You know, some teachers are brilliant at that EQ kind of assessment of what a student's needs are. So I don't want to blanket the whole profession in any ways. I've seen some things that are just amazing, bring tears to your eyes. They're so good at seeing the psychological impact of an experience in school and coping with it. And that's a lot more of what they have to learn how to do. It has to be a part of the profession, is learning that and learning a set of responses that and strategies that cope with it. In order for us to make progress, to get rid of these gaps that have been here throughout my entire painfully long career life, they're still here. They're still mysteriously hard to explain. They still invite in, unseemly explanations. Let's put it that way.
Just a quick thing, and then we'll go to other questions.
I think that, with growth mindset, there's been a concern about false growth mindset, teachers having superficial understandings of what a growth mindset means and then not engaging in effective practices that drive learning and growth in the classroom. I have students in my freshman seminar at Stanford who say, oh yeah, my teachers all told me a growth mindset is good, you should have a growth mindset, and that was sort of the extent of their growth mindset training. And so I think one answer to your question is that the devil is in the details, and we need to learn a whole lot more about how teachers can understand and communicate effectively about race and inequality within classroom context and at different kinds of classrooms at different kinds of developmental levels. Kids can understand and respond to different things at different times, and teachers can be sort of good partners for those kids in doing that, and that's a very important role for teachers to do, is to begin and engage in that conversation. But how they do that, if just left to their ways, some teachers will do fantastically and other teachers will butcher. And we need to understand that variability so we can drive practice more effectively, I think. It is very important how students make sense of their belonging as they come into school settings. So it's not just on the context. We can't only contend with the context and neglect the mindsets that students have as they make sense of a context and decide how to navigate it. It's very important for students have a lot of agency in school, especially at higher levels. And it's very important that they have mindsets that empower them to use that agency effectively. It's also very important that the context is one that responds in ways that allow that agency of students to become productive and effective. And then when we talk about the affordances of context, that's part of what we mean by that. So in the wise feedback case, it's very important that once the students had the new hypothesis that maybe their teachers could be trusted, that those teachers responded in ways that were productive. If you didn't have teachers responding in ways that were productive, you would never have seen longer term outcomes. Now, I think that the question of the awareness of students of exactly what you're saying is not something that we fully understand yet. And there's an interesting sort of case study from the context of values affirmation, where early research on awareness and values affirmation suggested that when students were made aware of what an affirmation was, it killed the effect. There were no longer benefits. Later research showed that was not true, that the original studies essentially confounded awareness with a lack of control. And that when students were aware of what the affirmation was doing, but they were allowed to feel themselves freely choosing to pursue that path as a means of benefiting their experience, you still got benefits. And so my suspicion, my working suspicion, is that things like belonging and growth mindset may work in similar ways. That is, that it can be that students can be aware of these things and for those things to still be effective. But if they feel like they're being forced upon them, or they feel inauthentic, or they feel not genuine, then you would not see the benefits.
I think that's a really important issue, and just trying to go right to the point. I mean, I think when people show interest in people, you trust them. If they're interested and open and curious, you begin to trust them more. So I think it's a strategy that for building trust that is broadly available, and that teachers teachers and supervisors can use effectively. I want to tell the story of this research, but I don't think we have the time to do it. But there's a nice study that just illustrates that you put people at ease by telling them, look, this conversation is difficult. Nobody really knows how to have it, but the way you should approach it is to ask questions and be interested, yeah, and be curious. Sounds really simple, but it's a decentering of yourself in a way that signals to the other person that they're being heard, and that you want to know who they are and what their feelings are, and that posture builds up trust and is a broadly applicable a technique. So I want to say that. I also wanted to deal with, just say a little thing about the students and empowering them to be participants in belongingness building and in trust building. I do think they should be entitled to resist sometimes too. I think that has to be available on the table. That if you've got a really racist teacher, like they should be able to get mad about that and have an audience for that. So I think that's part of the. It can't all be nuanced all the time. Sometimes you really do have an outrageous situation that you have to deal with it, and you don't want to give the expectation you should tolerate that. You need to resist it. So I just wanted to add that, but I do think they need careful instruction about how to participate. They need narratives that are hopeful. They need hope, and sometimes out of good intentions we foreclose hope. We give them maybe even a truthful but a dark picture of the world that they're in, and that's hard for a child to penetrate. So I think the challenge is to give them some sense of hope, and as a society, as a school community, we're moving in that kind of direction.